This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest is the Pulitzer Prize New York Times reporter Mark Mazzetti. He's just come out with a new book this week, The Way of the Knife, The CIA, a Secret Army, and a War at the Ends of the Earth. Can you talk, Mark, about the first drone strike in 2004? Who it targeted, who the U.S. killed for?
The CIA, up to 2004, had carried out a select number of drone strikes in Afghanistan, primarily in the war in Afghanistan, and one in Yemen. But then that got shut down when the president of Yemen refused to continue to allow them. And for several years, the United States was pushing to get armed drones in Pakistan because there was CIA officers were watching this collection of al-Qaeda operatives come from Afghanistan to Pakistan. But President Musharraf wasn't allowing any armed drone flights. He was allowing surveillance, but not armed drone flights. And at the same time, in early 2004, Nek Mohammed, who is a Pashtun tribal militant in South Waziristan, was raising his own militia to battle government troops in Pakistan. There were several very, very bloody battles in Wana and other parts of South Waziristan that happened after Musharraf decided to very reluctantly send troops into the tribal areas. They negotiated a peace deal between the Pakistani government and Nek Mohammed and his men. It didn't last very long, and increasingly the Pakistani government realized they needed to get rid of Nek Mohammed. During this time, the CIA made a proposal to the ISI, Pakistani spy service, that was, in essence, we will help you with Nek Mohammed. And Nek Mohammed certainly was someone who the U.S. was watching and concerned about, and he had launched some attacks over the border in Afghanistan, but he was not a high-level al-Qaeda figure. And he was considered to be more of Pakistan's problem than he was the Americans' problem. And basically, a deal was worked out where the United States would hunt down and kill Nek Mohammed, and this was sort of the foot in the door to allow armed drone attacks in Pakistan in narrow, what they call flight boxes, which are parts of the tribal areas where, through negotiation, the Pakistanis allowed the Americans to fly. So explain the significance of this, killing for another country, someone who is not a target of the United States, not to mention the whole question of who the United States targets. It was very interesting that the first strike in Pakistan was, not a senior al-Qaeda leader, but it was an enemy of the state of Pakistan. And it should be pointed out that Nek Mohammed was certainly helping and facilitating aspects of al-Qaeda. But again, if you look at high-value target lists that the United States had at the time, he was not one of them. This really paved the way for what we've seen is the escalation of the drone wars. It took several years for them to escalate. It was not, there was maybe a handful or maybe a dozen drone strikes from that point in 2004 up until 2008, when at the end of the Bush administration, President Bush really started ramping it up, and then President Obama ramped it up even further.
But can you also talk about the case of Raymond Davis? You say that what happened with him, a private contractor hired by the CIA, is more controversial in Pakistan even than the raid that captured and killed Osama bin Laden.
When I went to Pakistan last year to do reporting for the book, I had been interested in the Raymond Davis episode, but it wasn't until I went there and you talked to people, government officials, people on the street, that you realize that Raymond Davis has become sort of the boogeyman in Pakistan. It's an episode that's largely forgotten in the United States because the Osama bin Laden raid happened about a month later after Davis was released, and so that was forgotten. But Raymond Davis came to exemplify in the minds of many Pakistanis that the sort of CIA was conducting the secret war in Pakistan under the noses of the government, and that Davis was part of this army. He was
explain who he was and what happened.
So Raymond Davis was a CIA contractor, former special forces soldier hired by the CIA working in Lahore, Pakistan, where there was a group of CIA officers who were trying to gather intelligence about Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a Pakistani militant group. Davis, in late January 2011, was navigating the streets of Lahore. There is conflicting still accounts of the story, but he was approached by two men, and whom he said were brandishing weapons, and he shot them. And then things after that even got further out of control when an American vehicle showed up at the scene to rescue Davis and killed a motorcyclist. So that's a third victim, and that car drives away, and Davis is left there, and then he's quickly taken into custody by the police in Lahore.
But can we assume from this case that there are episodes like this that are more widespread? In other words, the use of private contractors who do the work, like Raymond Davis was doing in Pakistan, except their work is just better concealed. He just happened to be caught, as it were.
Certainly the CIA and the military have hired private contractors to do intelligence gathering. The private intelligence business is something that is booming, and what you saw was the CIA after 9/11 was so stretched by these various wars. That's why they would be turning to companies like Blackwater and other private security firms that could provide the resources. So Davis, I mean, again, in Pakistan, it was the sort of ultimate in conspiracies. He was a former soldier. He was a former Blackwater employee. He worked for the CIA, and so it seemed to confirm a lot of the worst conspiracies.
Let's go to President Obama in 2011, describing Raymond Davis as a diplomat.
With respect to Mr. Davis, our diplomat in Pakistan, we've got a very simple principle here, that every country in the world that is party to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations has upheld in the past and should uphold in the future. And that is, if our diplomats are in another country, then they are not subject to that country's local prosecution.
So this so-called diplomat had just killed two people, and another person was killed or critically wounded. Killed. Yes. So that's three people.
Right.
So talk about what happened to Raymond Davis then, and the significance of him working for the CIA at the time.
So what was happening at the time was the CIA had been sending a large number of its own people into Pakistan under various different false covers. The relationship between the CIA and the ISI, which, as I write in the book, started out actually as a pretty good relationship with some common interest. Over time, it become pretty toxic, and so by early 2011, most of the CIA's work in Pakistan was done without the cooperation of the ISI. So the U.S. was basically getting people into the country with, as I said, false covers with different visas. So Raymond Davis was admitted under a diplomatic passport. And so when President Obama said he is a diplomat, technically that was correct because he had some diplomatic status. However, there was a big dispute over whether he had diplomatic immunity, and of course he just killed two people. So it became an international incident very quickly. Once he's in jail, the CIA and the Obama administration decide, well, we need to stonewall. We need to not tell the Pakistanis what he was doing. There were elements in the U.S. government who pushed to just come clean, get him out of the country. But then a whole fight ensues inside the U.S. government of what to do. And then after a number of weeks, they do work out an arrangement. They come clean with the Pakistanis. They pay what they call blood money, and he is released from jail. The interesting thing that's going on during this whole time is that
one of the victims' wives committed suicide over this. She never thought, she said, that the person who killed her husband would be brought to justice.
That's right. That's right. And so that was another thing that inflamed passions in Pakistan, was when she killed herself. And this was one incident that, and I think the U.S. government started to say, okay, this isn't working. We have to get this guy out of the country, and the current strategy isn't working. Now, all during this time, and which is one of the more puzzling aspects of why there was this strategy, because they're watching this compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, where they're discussing this possible raid that against someone who might be Osama bin Laden, and why they didn't just try to get him out of the country immediately, broker a deal immediately with the Pakistanis, is puzzling when they had this whole other intelligence gathering operation going on. And I've talked to a lot of American officials, and I've asked them why, and they say they don't know why. In retrospect, they realize they made the wrong decision.
Tell us about Michael Furlong.
Michael Furlong was a former Pentagon official, senior civilian official, who worked in information operations, which are kind of psychological operations, propaganda, that type of thing, that the Pentagon increasingly started doing after the 9/11 attacks. The CIA used to be really into the propaganda business, but during budget cuts in the 90s and actually because of the internet, there were concerns inside the CIA about them doing this because American citizens are reading things on the internet. So the CIA is not allowed to propagandize against the American public. So if you try to plant a story in a foreign newspaper and American reads it online, well, that can be technically against the law. So anyway, the Pentagon was able to do some of this. So Furlong got into these operations, and as I describe in the book, he was able to sort of work with a number of different companies to build video games that the Pentagon was trying to distribute around the country, around the world, that were sort of pro-American themed video games. But one of the aspects of the operation was people would download them onto their cell phones, and the U.S. would be able to gather intelligence about the people who were downloading the games.
How?
And well, because they would go to websites, and the websites would be they'd set up websites where the games would be downloaded from, and they could monitor the websites, and they could track some information about the users. At a later,
I mean, it's amazing what you write. The game called Native Echo, every download would give the United States a window into the digital comings and goings of whomever was playing it, a cyber foothold that would allow American spies to potentially track and collect information on thousands of people.
Yeah, there were two things they were trying to do. They were trying to, on one hand, get some pro-American themes out, but at the same time, find out who's using these games, who's playing these games, and then store them into databases. And so that was something that especially Special Operations Command at the Pentagon really ramped up in around 2005 and 2006. At a later time, about a year later, Furlong was in Afghanistan, back and forth between Afghanistan and his job in the United States, and sort of running this really private spying operation that was going on primarily in Pakistan but also in Afghanistan. The commander at the time in Afghanistan, General McKiernan, was very angry that the CIA wasn't getting him any good intelligence about Pakistan. So Furlong, working with some others, basically hired their own people and were setting up intelligence networks in Pakistan, and those intelligence reports were then getting fed into classified Pentagon databases.
I want to read a comment from Anne-Marie Slaughter, the former Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. At a recent meeting of the American Society for International Law, she called for Obama to be more transparent on drones. She said, quote, "The idea that this president would leave office having dramatically expanded the use of drones, including against American citizens, without any public standards and no checks and balances, that there are no checks and there is no international agreement, I would find that to be both terrible and ultimately will undermine a great deal of what this president will have done for good." So before we conclude, can you comment on what Anne-Marie Slaughter has said and whether you think drone strikes are likely to diminish with the U.S. drawdown of troops from Afghanistan, or whether, in fact, they're likely to expand?
I think you'll see them continue in Pakistan certainly as long as there are U.S. troops in Afghanistan. And I would think that the United States would at least try to preserve the option of using them in the future. Now, whether Pakistan's government once and for all says no, we will have to see whether that happens. I do think that Anne-Marie Slaughter's quote, is indicative of a feeling in Washington, parts of the government, that there needs to be greater transparency and accountability to these strikes. President Obama, in his State of the Union address, said it's coming, and we will take steps to be more transparent with the Congress and with the American public. Thus far, we haven't seen what the plan is. But one of the things that's striking as a reporter when we were covering the John Brennan confirmation hearings was that members of Congress, members of the intelligence committees who have the highest levels of classification, the clearance, they hadn't even seen the memos, the legal opinions that justified things like the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki and others, and it's really striking that and they're the only ones who are allowed to know about these things. I mean, the most of Congress doesn't even have the clearance to have these discussions, but the committees themselves don't have the clearance, and so that was really striking. And so we'll see whether there is a greater push for more transparency.
And you, as a reporter, Mark. We see the greatest crackdown on whistleblowers that we have ever seen under any president. President Obama's administration is going after more whistleblowers than all presidential administrations combined in the past. And the role of journalists. How do you feel as you try to cover these issues? Do you feel the crackdown?
It's harder. There's no question. It's harder and harder. People are. This crackdown perhaps had its intended effect, which was maybe not to go prosecute the cases that have been brought, but also to scare others into not talking. And so I find that in the last couple of years covering national security issues, you just find people who were perhaps once more eager to talk or willing to talk for reasons that not just because they were whistleblowers, but because they thought it was important for reporters to have context and information about some of these operations. Those people are increasingly less likely to talk.
And you yourself being prosecuted or put under a kind of spotlight from the administration. I mean,
it's certainly worrisome for us, and it's worrisome that they go after sources, and it brings the reporters into it as well. I think we're at a critical time here to hope, hopefully this ends, but once there is a momentum in some of these cases, the Justice Department works in its own ways, and so people, once they make cases, they tend to try to make other cases, and so that's what's concerning for us.
And what you were most surprised by in this reporting and the reporting you've been doing? I mean, you won a number of awards for exposing the destruction of interrogation videotapes. Maybe you could go from that to what most surprised you in your latest investigations.
Well, the tape story was just something that, in covering the beat, you talk to enough people and do. Sometimes it's fortuitous when you talk to someone or talk to a couple of people who give you hints of things, and then you report it more, and then pretty soon you think you have a story, and that's what happened in that case.
And those videotapes were videotapes of.
Oh, sorry. So the videotapes were videotapes of 2 al-Qaeda detainees, the first 2 detainees in CIA custody in Thailand, and they were taken in 2002, and then they did show some of the techniques like waterboarding, and they said they then sat in a safe in the CIA station in Thailand for several years as the CIA was pushing to basically get rid of them. And some members of Congress had known about them and warned, you shouldn't do this. And then after several years, as the pressure built and as there was increased public scrutiny into the CIA interrogation program, Jose Rodriguez, who was the head of the clandestine service, talked to some lawyers within the agency, decided that he had the authority to order the destruction, and sent the cable out to Thailand, where the tapes were sitting in the safe and the tapes were destroyed.
And what you were most surprised by now?
Well, I think one of the things that most surprised me in doing the book, and what I tried to focus on, was that when you do this kind of war, and you're in wars outside of traditional war zones and outside of traditional places where the military can go, you tend to rely on a lot of different characters and a lot of the Michael Furlongs, Dwayne Claridge, who was a former CIA officer who was involved in this private spying operation. There's a woman named Michelle Ballerin who I write about, who was was hired by the Pentagon to gather intelligence in Somalia, and then was
she had run for Congress.
She had run for Congress in the 80s in West Virginia, and lives out in a state in Virginia, and then got involved in pirate hostage negotiations. So I tried to have at least to give readers some sense of the flavor of the type of characters that are involved in the shadow war, and so some of the most fun I had in the book was actually trying to highlight some of these stories, which are sort of untold in the last 12 years.
And finally, I know you have to go, but the story you just told about the destruction of the tapes, the CIA officer directly involved in the 2005 decision to destroy the tapes, occupying the top position within the CIA's clandestine service.
Right. So she, at the time, was the chief of staff of Jose Rodriguez, and
she is.
And she is.
Her name?
I can't report her name. She is still undercover, and I mean, several reporters do know her name, and thus far, no one has chosen to disclose it. But she is now the head of the clandestine service, acting head of the clandestine service, and at the end, she is. John Brennan is now deciding whether to make her the permanent head of the clandestine service. But she did have a very, very intimate role, not only in this episode, but in the counterterrorism center, its growth over the last decade inside the CIA.
Mark Mazzetti, we want to thank you very much for
Thank you for having
us.
me. I appreciate it.
National security correspondent for the New York Times, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. His book has come out this week, The Way of the Knife, The CIA, a Secret Army, and a War at the Ends of the Earth. An excerpt was published in the Times this Sunday called A Secret Deal on Drones Sealed in Blood. Another excerpt appears in this weekend's Times Magazine called How a Single Spy Helped Turn Pakistan Against the United States. We will link to these at democracynow.org. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the Israeli journalist Amira Haas joins us in studio. Stay with us. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.